There's a particular kind of silence that follows humiliation. It's not the quiet of peace or reflection, but a hollow, thudding silence that presses against your ribs and makes your throat feel too tight for air. That's the silence I sat in the moment Linda's laughter pierced through the marble-lined dining hall like a dagger aimed directly at James. We were at my sister's estate, if you could even call it that without rolling your eyes. It was more like a mansion carved into a cliffside, overlooking the sea like it owned the view. Linda had invited the whole extended family to what she called a casual summer reunion, which in her world translated to private chefs, string quartets, and staff in matching linen uniforms. It was a weekend of curated elegance, of sun hats and champagne, of conversations that danced around money like it was oxygen. James, my husband, stood quietly by the outdoor buffet, his hand wrapped around a glass of iced tea instead of the wine he never developed a taste for. He didn't care for showmanship. He was the kind of man who found joy in honest work, the kind who rose before the sun and came home with calloused hands and tired eyes, but a heart that never once stopped giving. He was the man I fell in love with 15 years ago when he offered to help me carry a bookshelf into my first solo apartment, and I saw in his eyes the kind of steadiness my chaotic childhood had always lacked. Linda never liked James. That wasn't news. What shocked me that afternoon, though, was how unapologetically cruel she chose to be. "So, James," she said, swirling her glass of white wine and lifting one manicured brow, still doing the "what is it again?" "Oh yes, manual labor. You poor thing. You must be exhausted just looking at our driveway." Her tone was syrupy sweet, but the sting was unmistakable. The kind of insult that wears pearls and heels. I opened my mouth to intervene, to shift the conversation, but she was already leaning in with a smirk. "I mean, if you're ever looking for a side gig, I've been meaning to get the marble floors and the foyer buffed. You'd be perfect. I'll even pay you." Don't say I never supported family. People laughed. Not because it was funny, but because when Linda spoke, people laughed the way tourists laugh when the tour guide cracks a joke. They feel like they're supposed to. The sound of it twisted my stomach. James didn't flinch. He just gave a tight smile and nodded once, sipping his tea. His silence was louder than any words could have been, and it burned me with guilt and anger all at once. I could feel my cheeks flush, my heart pounding with the kind of heat that sits between shame and fury. I reached out, placing a gentle hand on his arm, trying to ground both of us. "Linda," I said, forcing my voice into calmness, "maybe let's not turn this into a roast. It's a family reunion, not open mic night." But she wasn't done. "Oh, relax, Anna. It's just a joke," she said, the grin never leaving her face. "Besides, some of us actually need a good cleaning service. What, do you think I should be embarrassed to hire my brother-in-law? Please. I believe in supporting small businesses, especially family-run ones." It was a masterstroke of condescension wrapped in faux generosity. She turned to her husband Richard, who sat 2 seats down, quietly nursing a whiskey and wearing the same unreadable expression he always wore in these settings. If he ever had opinions, he kept them as tightly sealed as the decanters in Linda's bar. Richard gave a small nod, eyes never lifting from his drink. His silence was a shield, but whether he used it to protect Linda or himself, I never could tell. I stood frozen for a second, the conversation continuing around us as if nothing had happened, as if my husband hadn't just been publicly mocked and offered a mop in place of dignity. I looked at James, waiting for him to say something, but he only gave me that same patient smile. The one he wore when things hurt too much to put into words. Later that evening, we stood side by side on the terrace, the sun dipping low over the waves and turning the water gold. I could hear laughter from inside, Linda's voice carrying easily through the open doors. James leaned on the railing, his hands folded, eyes on the horizon. "I'm sorry," I said softly, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I felt like I had. Like I had brought him into a room where he would never be seen as enough, no matter how much love and loyalty he gave. He looked at me, his brown eyes warm and steady. "You don't owe me an apology, Anna," he said. She doesn't know me. And she doesn't have to. But I knew that wasn't the point. He didn't care that Linda didn't respect him. What cut was that I had let her say it, that no one at that table had stood up for him. That my silence had made room for her laughter. That night, back in our guest room on the far end of the house, I sat in the corner armchair, my dress wrinkled, makeup half worn off, replaying the scene like a loop. James was already in bed, one arm tucked behind his head, eyes closed but not asleep. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked quietly. He didn't open his eyes. "Regret what?" "Being married to me. Being part of this." I gestured vaguely toward the window, where Linda's voice still echoed faintly down the halls. He opened his eyes then, rolled onto his side, and reached for my hand. "Anna," he said, "I'd build houses with my bare hands every day for the rest of my life just to come home to you. Don't let her mess with your head." I nodded, even as my throat tightened. Because it wasn't just about Linda. It was about how families like mine saw worth. It was about how a man could give his whole heart and still be treated like furniture, useful but unremarkable. And I realized then that something had shifted. A hairline crack in the mirror of our family that would only deepen from here. I didn't know yet what it would break or what would fall through. But I knew this wasn't over. There are moments that split cleanly through memory, like a thunderclap against glass, sudden, shocking, and impossible to unhear. That moment came just seconds after Linda's final, sneering remark, when the laughter around her dimmed and something in the air shifted, sharp and electric like the edge of a coming storm. I hadn't noticed Richard rise from his seat. He had been so still for most of the evening, quietly sipping his whiskey with that same unreadable look he always wore, the kind that seemed practiced over years of enduring Linda's sharp tongue and louder personality. But then, as if a string inside him had finally snapped, his voice rose, clear, cutting, and with a fury I never imagined him capable of. "Stop talking nonsense," he shouted, slamming his glass on the table with a force that startled everyone. "He's my boss." The words rang out like a gunshot in a chapel. For a few seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. Even the ever-present string quartet in the corner faltered mid-note, their instruments falling silent as their eyes flicked toward the man who had just shattered the curated piece of Linda's carefully constructed world. Linda's mouth opened, then closed, her eyes wide as if her brain couldn't quite catch up to what she'd just heard. She blinked rapidly, her perfect makeup holding steady even as her face turned a shade paler, her grip tightening around the stem of her wine glass as if it were the only solid thing anchoring her in that moment. What did you say?" she stammered, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. Richard didn't waver. He stood straight, his voice no longer loud, but firm, deliberate, and ice-cold with restrained rage. "James is my boss, Linda. He owns the contracting company we hired for the West Coast projects. The entire division. The reason our expansion even exists." I watched Linda's throat move as she swallowed hard, the shock colliding with humiliation in her expression like two speeding trains. Her gaze flicked to James, who, to his credit, hadn't even flinched. He stood beside me, his hands still resting gently on my lower back, steady and quiet, like he had expected this moment to come all along but had chosen not to force it. "But you said, you work in acquisitions," Linda managed, her voice trembling, the carefully manicured mask cracking around the edges. "I do," Richard replied, his jaw tight. "And James oversees most of what we acquire, including the teams I report to. He's one of the sharpest minds I've worked under in 20 years. So next time you want to play queen in front of your family, maybe don't humiliate the man who signs your husband's performance reviews." It was the kind of statement that sucked all the air out of the room. The faces around us were a study in disbelief, forks frozen halfway to mouths, wine glasses clutched in still hands, eyes darting between Linda and Richard and then landing, with a mixture of embarrassment and awe, on James. The man they had all silently dismissed, the one who had stood in his plain slacks and simple shoes, not demanding attention but commanding respect in a way none of them had seen until now. I wasn't sure who I felt more for in that moment, James, whose dignity had been restored in the most public way imaginable, or Linda, whose carefully constructed reality had just shattered beneath the weight of her arrogance. But I'll tell you what I did feel most of all, a sharp, bitter satisfaction. Not because I wanted Linda to hurt, despite everything, she was still my sister, but because I needed her to see what James had always been. Not a project, not a man I had settled for, not someone to clean her tiles and scrub her judgment off her walls, but a man with integrity, with grit, with quiet power. The silence stretched longer than it should have, and in that stillness, I caught James's eyes. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just nodded toward the door with a slight tilt of his head, his message wordless but clear. This wasn't our scene anymore. I took his hand and squeezed it, then gently turned and walked with him toward the archway that led back inside the house. No one stopped us. I'm not even sure they breathed. We didn't speak as we made our way through the lavish hallway, past the bar, the velvet couches, and the glinting chandelier that sparkled above us like the crown jewels of a kingdom we didn't belong to. We stepped outside into the cool evening air, the sea breeze soft against my skin, and only then did I let out the breath I'd been holding since Linda's first cruel remark. James slid his fingers through mine, and we walked slowly toward the gravel drive where our car was parked beneath an overhanging oak. He hadn't said a word since Richard's outburst, and I didn't push him to break the silence. Not yet. When we reached the car, I turned to him. "You knew, didn't you?" I asked, my voice low. He smiled faintly, his eyes tired but warm. "I figured she'd find out eventually. I just didn't expect it to happen like that." "I'm sorry," I said quietly, my voice catching. "I should have said more. I should have done more when she—" He stopped me with a gentle touch to my cheek. "You were there. That's all I needed." And maybe that was the most heartbreaking part of all, that this man had been so used to being underestimated, to being talked over and looked through, that simply standing beside him felt like enough. It shouldn't have been. I looked up at that house one last time, a towering fortress of glass and steel and emptiness. Inside, my sister would be unraveling, trying to respin the narrative, to salvage her dignity with excuses and misplaced anger. But none of that mattered now. James started the engine, and as we drove away, I let the wind whip through the open window and carry away the remnants of that day, the shame, the silence, the sound of laughter that had cut too deep. They say you don't really see yourself until someone holds up a mirror you weren't prepared to face. For Linda, that mirror came not in the form of my words or even James's dignified silence, but in Richard's quiet, steady truth-telling, delivered behind closed doors after we left. I didn't witness the conversation, of course, but I know my sister. I know the way her face tightens when she's been exposed, the way her pride curls in on itself like a drying leaf, desperate to preserve some sense of control. I imagine she stood there, arms crossed, lips pressed together, trying to summon the confidence that had evaporated so completely the moment Richard said those 4 words, "He's my boss." Later that week, I got the full story from Richard himself, not because I asked, but because he called me out of the blue and said, "Anna, I need to tell you what happened after you left." Not for James, not even for Linda, just because I think you deserve to hear it. He'd taken her aside, gently, he said, though I doubt Linda saw it that way at the time, and explained in careful detail that James wasn't just some contractor swinging hammers or hauling debris. He was the founder and CEO of a highly sought-after project management and construction firm, one that had quietly built a reputation over the past decade for handling high-end developments without the arrogance that often came with the territory. Richard's company had been eyeing James's firm for months before finally extending a contract to oversee a multi-million-dollar expansion on the West Coast. What really impressed the board wasn't just the portfolio, Richard had told her, but the way James carries himself. He's not flashy. He listens more than he talks. When he speaks, people lean in. That, apparently, was the part that shook her the most. I could picture it clearly, the dawning realization in her eyes, the rapid unraveling of the narrative she had built around him. The version of James she mocked so freely was built on assumption, on her narrow definition of success and respectability. To her, wealth had to come with flash, with pedigree, with a certain polished sheen. She couldn't fathom that the man in worn work boots and a button-down shirt could be the quiet force behind projects her own husband's firm considered foundational to its growth. According to Richard, she didn't speak for a long time after he finished. She just sat there, lips trembling slightly, staring at the floor like a child caught lying, her world shifting beneath her feet. "She asked me why I didn't tell her sooner," he said, his voice weary. "And I told her the truth. Because she wouldn't have believed me. Because she didn't want to believe someone like James could be more than what she saw on the surface." After that, we hung up. I thanked him for his honesty, and he thanked me for my patience, though I wasn't sure I had earned it. I sat with that conversation for a long time, wondering how Linda was dealing with her shame. She hadn't called, hadn't texted, not even a single passive-aggressive email disguised as civility. That silence, for Linda, spoke volumes. But while she sat in her silence, stewing in guilt and reevaluating everything she thought she knew about class and dignity, James sat in his own storm, quieter, deeper, and more complicated. He didn't talk about it much. Not right away. But I could see it on his face in the mornings, in the way he lingered over his coffee, eyes unfocused and jaw slightly clenched. It was there in the small pauses between sentences when we talked about work or weekend plans. He wasn't just hurt, he was wrestling with something deeper. Something I knew only he could untangle. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun sink below the trees, he finally spoke. "I don't know if I can forgive her," he said, his voice low but clear. "Not because I want to hold a grudge. I don't. But because I don't know if she's sorry for the right reasons." I didn't respond right away. I just listened. Because that's what he always did for me. "She didn't just insult me, Anna. She made you feel small, too. She took her vision of success and used it like a weapon. Against both of us." I nodded slowly, wrapping my fingers around the mug in my hands, the ceramic still warm against my skin. "She's your sister," he added after a long pause. "And I don't want to come between you. But I need time. And I need her to see what she did. Not just say she's sorry." Those words stayed with me. Because forgiveness, I've come to realize, isn't something you owe anyone. It's something you offer when the weight of carrying the grudge becomes heavier than the pain of letting it go. But James wasn't there yet. And truthfully, neither was I. I thought back to all the times Linda had measured people by their resumes, their zip codes, the price tags on their shoes. How many dinners had we sat through while she name-dropped designers and bragged about luxury renovations that, frankly, only made her home feel colder? How many times had she implied, sometimes subtly, sometimes not, that James and I lived beneath our potential simply because we chose substance over spectacle? Maybe this moment was her reckoning. Maybe she would look in the mirror and see something uncomfortable staring back, a woman who confused wealth with worth, who mistook humility for failure. I hope so. But for now, James and I chose peace over proximity. We stayed in our lane, our little house with its creaky porch and wild garden. We laughed over simple dinners and shared quiet mornings, finding joy not in how others saw us, but in how we saw each other. It started with a knock on our door one quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind of knock that didn't demand anything, just waited, uncertain and soft. James and I had spent most of the morning in the backyard tending to the little vegetable patch we'd built together last spring. The sun was still high, the soil warm under our nails, and the world had, for once, felt uncomplicated. That knock, though, that hesitant little sound, pulled me out of that rare stillness and straight into the tension I hadn't fully released since the family reunion. When I opened the door, Linda stood there, arms folded tightly across her chest, her face a strange mixture of determination and shame. She was dressed down, more than I'd ever seen her in public, simple jeans, an old cardigan I remembered from our college years, and not a hint of makeup. Her eyes looked tired, like someone who hadn't just missed sleep but had spent too many nights wrestling with themselves in the dark. "Hi," she said, her voice nearly lost in the breeze. "I didn't call because I thought you might not pick up." She wasn't wrong. I hadn't blocked her, but I hadn't exactly been waiting by the phone either. I stepped aside and motioned for her to come in. James was still outside, bent over the tomato vines, and I knew he'd seen her car by now. I didn't know if he would come in. I didn't know if he wanted to, but I let her speak anyway. "I've been awful," she said, not sitting, not removing her sunglasses, just standing in the middle of our living room like a guest in someone else's life. "And I'm not here to make excuses. I needed to look you in the eye and say it. What I said about James. What I did to James. And to you. It was cruel. Thoughtless. And honestly, it's been a long time coming." She paused, her voice trembling a little as she removed the sunglasses and finally looked at me with bare, red-rimmed eyes. "I've always chased after the wrong kind of success. Measured people with the wrong ruler. I saw James and assumed things that weren't just wrong, they were disgusting. And I hurt you both because I didn't see the value in the life you built together. I mocked something I didn't even understand." I stood still, my arms crossed, not from anger anymore, but from habit. I wasn't used to this side of Linda. Not the tear-streaked apology. Not the uncomfortable vulnerability. For most of our adult lives, she had been the kind of person who never looked back, never admitted fault, never sat still long enough to let regret sink its teeth in. And yet, here she was. She reached into her purse and pulled out something I didn't expect, a Tupperware container, carefully sealed and still slightly warm. "I made banana bread," she said, giving a faint, awkward laugh. "I remembered you used to love it when Mom made it, but hers was always dry. I found a recipe online with yogurt and brown butter. Thought I'd try. I guess this is my peace offering." I took it, more out of surprise than hunger, and offered her the faintest smile. "Thank you," I said. "That's unexpected, but kind." From the corner of my eye, I saw James enter through the back door, his step slow, deliberate. He wiped his hands on a towel, his face unreadable but not angry. Just guarded, like someone who had built a wall that he wasn't quite ready to lower. Linda turned when she heard him and froze. They stood there, two people who had once shared holidays and inside jokes, now strangers in the space where family was supposed to live. She spoke first. "James," she said, voice trembling, "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that. But I need to tell you how wrong I was. I didn't just insult your work. I insulted your worth. And I'm so sorry." James didn't speak right away. He looked at her the way a man looks at a puzzle that suddenly makes more sense than he wants it to. Then he exhaled, slow and steady, and set the towel on the kitchen table. "I appreciate the apology," he said, his voice calm but cautious. "But it's not my forgiveness you should rush to get. It's something you earn, not something you ask for in one visit with banana bread." Linda nodded, biting her lip. "I know. That's why I'm not here to force it. I'll keep showing up, if you'll let me." And she did. Over the next few weeks, Linda didn't flood us with gifts or dramatic gestures. Instead, she started showing up in small, steady ways that were unlike the woman I'd known. She called not with apologies, but with questions. Real questions. She asked James about his projects. She listened when he spoke about the business. One weekend, she offered to help in the garden, and though her designer nails weren't made for digging, she stuck her hands in the dirt without complaint. It was awkward at first. There were silences that used to be filled with sarcasm, now replaced with careful words. But slowly, something softened. One afternoon, James told me, as we sat on the porch sipping iced tea, "She's trying. I can see that now. And I guess everyone gets one moment to be awful. What matters is what they do after." I nodded, watching the wind stir the leaves above us. "Do you think you can forgive her?" He looked at me, the faintest smile playing at the corner of his lips. "I think I already started. And in that moment, I felt something release. A tension I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying loosened from my shoulders like a heavy coat I didn't need anymore. Sometimes, redemption doesn't come in grand confessions or sweeping acts of grace. Sometimes, it's in banana bread and dirt under the nails, and the quiet, persistent effort to rebuild what pride once broke. It wasn't some grand gesture, not the kind of cinematic finale where violins swell and hearts mend over candlelight. It was just a quiet Tuesday evening when James looked at me across the dinner table, a fork dangling from his fingers, and said, "I think it's time." I didn't need to ask what he meant. He was talking about inviting Linda and Richard over, not to punish, not to lecture, but to open a space that had been closed for far too long. The walls we'd built since that chaotic family reunion had served their purpose. They'd protected us from further hurt, from shallow apologies and forced niceties, but they had also kept out something we both missed more than we liked to admit: real connection. "Are you sure?" I asked gently, watching his expression for signs of hesitation. James nodded, the smallest smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah," he said, setting his fork down and reaching for my hand. "I've thought about it a lot, and I don't want to carry this weight anymore. I'd rather make space than keep score." So we did what once would have felt impossible. We set the table not just with plates and glasses, but with the hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be a turning point. When Linda and Richard arrived, the air held a cautious stillness, like the room itself was holding its breath. Linda stepped in first, carrying a bottle of wine she'd probably researched for hours to make sure it matched the meal we'd planned. She wore a simple blouse and jeans again, her new uniform, it seemed, and her smile, though nervous, was genuine. "Thank you for having us," she said, her voice more tentative than I'd ever heard it. "Come in," James said, and the tone in his voice was kind, not cold. "Dinner's just about ready." We didn't rush into the hard conversations. Instead, we let the evening unfold the way most family dinners should, over roasted vegetables and grilled chicken, with laughter about the little things: bad traffic, weather predictions gone wrong, and a neighbor's out-of-control Halloween decorations that still hadn't come down. For a while, it almost felt like before. Before the bitterness. Before the cracks in the foundation. But after dessert, Linda's banana bread, no less, served warm with whipped cream, we settled into the inevitable. The moment when silence meant more than words, and everyone at the table knew it was time to name what had passed between us. James, always calm in moments like these, took the lead. "I invited you both here," he said, his voice even and clear, "because I didn't want that night to be the last word between us. I needed time to let go of the hurt. And I wanted you to understand that what you said, what you implied, wasn't just offensive. It was deeply personal." Linda lowered her eyes, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When she spoke, her voice trembled but held steady. "I know," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "And I've replayed that day more times than I can count. I was cruel. I reduced you to a stereotype in my head and said things that I thought were clever when they were actually poisonous." She paused, exhaling as if to clear the last of her pride from her lungs. "I spent so much of my life thinking value came from what you wore, where you lived, how loudly you could broadcast your success. But watching Richard stand up for you, hearing that I had mocked a man who built something with integrity and quiet confidence, it broke something in me. Or maybe it woke something up. Either way, I've been learning to see differently since then." She turned to me then, her gaze soft but unflinching. "And Anna, I didn't just insult James. I insulted you. I mocked the life you chose as if it were beneath me, when in reality, it's what I envy the most: partnership, peace, and love that doesn't need to be paraded to be real." I felt something inside me loosen. Not dissolve completely, but shift, just enough to let the warmth seep in again. James nodded, his shoulders relaxing in a way that told me he'd waited a long time for this, not the apology, but the authenticity behind it. "I accept your apology," he said, his voice a little rougher now. "Not because it erases what happened, but because I see that you've changed. and because carrying resentment feels heavier than offering grace. We sat in that quiet for a while, letting the forgiveness settle between us like dust on a long-forgotten shelf. No one rushed to fill the silence. It didn't need filling. It needed honoring. From that night forward, something shifted in Linda, not in a performative way, but in the small, steady ways that build trust slowly, like bricks in a foundation that won't crack at the first sign of pressure. She started asking James about his business, not with idle curiosity, but with real respect. She shared his company's posts on social media. She introduced him to a friend who needed help managing a historical renovation project, singing his praises without embellishment. And when the project launched, she didn't attend for the press or the social clout. She showed up early, brought coffee for the crew, and stayed in the background, watching and learning. She even began showing up for me in ways I didn't expect. One afternoon, I came home to find a stack of books on our porch, each one wrapped in brown paper with handwritten notes on the front, little messages from Linda. This one made me think of your strength. I'm learning about empathy. This helped. A reminder that humility is beautiful. Over time, the relationship we rebuilt wasn't the one we'd had as children or young women competing in ways neither of us understood. It was something newer, something deeper, born not from perfection, but from reckoning, humility, and a shared decision to choose each other over ego. Family, I've learned, isn't about never getting it wrong. It's about who's willing to show up after the wrong, admit the pain, and start again.